and then we can start talking about your book. So, okay, welcome everybody. I'm very pleased to introduce today Heather McDonald. She is the Thomas Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributor editor of City Journal, and a New York Times bestselling author. She's written very many books, and today she's here to talk about her most recent book, titled When Race Trumps Merit. So welcome, Heather. This is your second time at our seminar series, and we are really happy to have you again. So welcome. And so let me. Heather asked that we run this as an interview. So I prepare a bunch of questions. I'm going to be asking a few questions to Heather. But if you feel annoyed by my questions, or if you get bored, just feel free to chime in with your own questions. I'm just trying to get the conversation started here. But as I said, feel free to chime in. So the book has essentially three parts. And I would like to start, briefly talking about your background and your experiences. You are viewed as a conservative commentator, but actually you started, if I remember correctly, you started as a liberal postmodern English literature student. And so can you tell us a little bit about this ideological journey or evolution?
Well, it wasn't ideological to begin with. I was never politically very involved, and I only came to understand the ideological valence of deconstruction after the fact. That having been said, I think deconstruction was in some ways much less ideological than what we have now, because, as I've often said, I was granted, even though I was a fanatical, uncritical acolyte of deconstruction, something that I deeply regret now because I just simply wasted my time struggling with Jacques Derrida instead of reading more Alexander Pope or Tobias Smollett. It was absolutely uninterested in identity. So I got to read the greatest works of Western literature without ever thinking to complain that I was not reading authors who matched my so-called identity. The Paul de Man and Jacques Derrida were elitists. We read Plato, Rousseau, Kleist, Proust. So I'm very grateful for that. And as I say, I was drawn into deconstruction. It seemed like the hottest thing on campus at the time. I'd always been interested in language. This was purported to be a theory of language, a exceedingly odd one. It was also a theory of the human self. It claimed that there was no real reality to a human being, that we were all merely tropes of language. That books were not about love, yearning, eros, jealousy, pettiness, hatred, grandeur, but instead every single novel, every single poem that has ever been written was about itself, and it was about its own failure. This is patently ridiculous, and many of my classmates at Yale were smart enough to see how ridiculous it was. Sadly, not I. So I got involved in this and aspired to become an academic. I was studying to go into comparative literature. I studied linguistics at Cambridge University, and that was my savior. I realized through studying actual linguistics, whether it was semantics or phonetics, I fell particularly in love with speech act theory, John Searle and J.L. Austin, how to do things with words, that everything that my professors back at Yale had been saying that I had received uncritically was completely specious. I had revered these people. I fell in love with all my professors because for me, knowledge is a source of eros. And I realized it was all a fraud. I nevertheless went back to Yale, started a PhD in comparative literature, but I had like a complete, I don't want to sound melodramatic because it was hardly something truly emotional, but it was in a sense an intellectual breakdown. I eventually ended up, I quit. I eventually ended up going to law school, sadly, because I was still bitten by the theory bug, and I went to Stanford because of my interest in critical legal studies, and I thought that the study of legal hermeneutics would raise some of the same issues that I'd seemingly walked away from in literary studies. At that point, I was still not particularly political. I remember buying a T-shirt at the Stanford Law School. This was in the early 80s that said, Reagan busters don't get slimed again. I remember feeling, without particular knowledge, the school's universal wave of revulsion when Clarence Pendleton, Reagan's EEOC head, came to give a talk. So, you know, I don't think it was shut down. Things were a little different back then, but the dominant ethos in law schools was very much the same. And I can tell you, Stanford law student body has gone even further left than when I was there in the 80s. So I then eventually ended up in New York. And what actually turned me into a conservative, I had always, for some reason, I had always opposed racial preferences. I had always believed in meritocracy, and that bears on the book, obviously. I've never believed that there's any excuse for lowering standards. But I arrived in New York at a time when Al Sharpton, still in his fat athletic suit wearing days, was leading all sorts of boycotts against Korean grocers, against the diamond merchants. It was a time of high racial tension. And I started writing for City Journal, which is the Manhattan Institute's quarterly. And since I knew nothing, I knew absolutely nothing about the world, and I knew that I knew nothing, I figured that my only value added as a reporter, which I'd never been, was to go out and actually do on-the-ground reporting. So I went to high crime neighborhoods, I went to housing projects, I went to welfare offices, I snuck into welfare offices, or I accosted their clients on the sidewalk coming out. I went to homeless shelters, and I started looking at the revolution that was then transforming New York City under Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, his fight against the welfare industrial complex, his fight against the criminal excuse-making complex. And what I learned from the ground up, without any prior exposure to conservative ideology. I mean, I remember in Washington, D.C., I had a roommate in the 80s, late 80s, who subscribed to National Review. I didn't even know what this was. I'd never heard of it. When I came to New York, I'd never heard of commentary. So I can truly say that I proceeded empirically and through a non-parti pris view of the world. Empirically, I arrived at a conservative worldview. I heard from the clients of the welfare state that the welfare state was failing. I heard from people in high crime neighborhoods that the opponents of the police were destroying their quality of life. So that's how I became a conservative, and I guess I haven't looked back since then. Although a little bit I have. I've been reading it recently. I've been on an Audible reading mission for Black history and Black civil rights history, and I have to say it leads me to think that there's a slight whitewashing going on with traditional conservative narratives of American history. But I'm torn at this point, and I have not really figured out how to reconcile my reading with a reasonable narrative about the American past. But otherwise, I guess I could legitimately be called solidly conservative at this point.
Thank you, Heather. This, I think, is a great segue to talk about your book. As you said, your book is about the meritocracy, and you open the book with the following words. You say, the year 2020 may go down as a pivotal moment in American history. So what happened in 2020 that is so important?
Mass hysteria broke out across the country. It had been primed. This was not particularly new. I remember giving a speech at the Hoover Institution that was not necessarily well received by donors back in 2017, I think it was, whatever the year of the Jussie Smollett race hoax was, saying that America's elites are in this absolute hysterical state of trying to find phony instances of racism to justify calling themselves white supremacists. So this had been going on for a long time, and all you guys in academia know that better than I do. But the George Floyd death was universally regarded as a symptom of widespread white supremacy, and so you had every institution, mainstream institution in the country, putting out these preposterous self-denunciations about their own racism. The university presidents, I mean, I don't need to remind you how utterly nauseating these statements were from the get-go. I mean, truly the greatest moment of the twilight of the Trump administration was the investigation of Christopher Ice Gruber at Princeton for saying that Princeton was systemically racist, and okay, we'll call your bluff there, and then we better start investigating you for civil rights violations. So the universities were amplifying their own rhetoric, but you also had corporations, you had classical music organizations, you had opera organizations, museums declaring that from here on out, their fundamental mission was to be anti-racist. So right now, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City has declared itself an anti-racist institution, and that philosophy has completely transformed the way it curates shows.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. I'm planning to ask you about the three main parts of your book. But before that, I wanted to talk about the ideology behind sort of what you call is the demolition of the standards. What is the ideology behind this?
Well, the ideology is that any standard, whether it's meritocratic or behavioral, that has a disparate impact on Blacks is by definition racist. And here's the takeaway. As long as racism remains the only allowable explanation for racial disparities, the left wins. End of story. It is all coming down. I cannot stress this enough. As long as the left can point to any single standard, whether it's a reading exam, a medical licensing exam, or a criminal law standard that says you shall not turnstile jump or shoplift, and if those standards produce disparate impact on Blacks, either resulting in the underrepresentation in an institution, so the fact that we do not have 13% Black physicists at the Stanford physics department, or 13% Black engineers at Google, or that we have over 13% Black prisoners in the prison population. If the only allowable explanation for that lack of racial proportionality is racism, the standards are coming down. Every sort of civilizational norm that has been devised that assumes bourgeois behavior will be tarred, and the speed with which things are being tossed overboard is astounding. That's why every gifted and talented program in the country is under attack if it has not been dismantled already, because our educational elites and administrators have decided that it is better not to encourage our most talented students with math skills to excel and to maximize their talents to the fullest potential. We would rather hold them back than contemplate a math PhD program or a math professoriate that is not racially proportional. As I say, it is all coming down.
So you argue that these skill gaps are very real. And so I have two questions. So let me be a bit of the advocate of the devil here. So the first one is, what explains these gaps in your opinion? And whether racism may be a factor at all behind these academic skill gaps or crime rate gaps, etc.
Well, racism in schools, forget it. I mean, one of the early things that has been going on with the disparate impact standard, and I also want to say that disparate impact obviously rose in the legal context as a way to expand the civil rights statutes, and it has instantiations in the Code of Federal Regulations and statutes, but it's not enough to just, even if you had an administration that said, I'm going to get rid of disparate impact in every code book, in every statute, that wouldn't do it, because by now the disparate impact conceit does not rest on a necessary legal statutory or regulatory foundation. It is simply a mindset. But one of the early legal applications of disparate impact theory was in school discipline. And we were told that if Black students are disciplined at higher rates than white students, it must be because the teachers are racist. And the answer is we will forbid students from being suspended if they beat up on their teacher, or if they're insubordinate in class, if they're fighting with other students, because that has a disparate impact on Blacks. Well, the idea that teachers are racist and that they are gratuitously and without basis pulling Black students out of the classroom is preposterous. Teaching is the most left-wing profession in the country. Teacher ed school is one long marination in social justice theory. One can always try and go back in the desperate search for racism. You can, I guess, move the clock back or move spatially back to try to find something that we can use that will move us away from personal responsibility. The game on the left is to deny any personal agency to favored victim groups. But as far as I'm concerned, the behavioral gaps, whether it's in regards to crime or whether it's regards to academic skills, are so glaring and so obvious that it is way premature to fall back on some phlogiston of systemic racism when you can see, and if public school teachers weren't so compromised, the few ones that have spoken out describe, and I've observed this myself, the utter hell of inner city classrooms, of students, with their headsets on, with their backs to the teachers. They're not taking their textbooks home. Parents are not making sure that the kids show up in class. The Black truancy rate in California is 4 times higher than that of whites. I've posed a thought experiment that if Blacks acted like Asians for 10 or 15 years in everything that bears on academic success, with regards to parental involvement, an obsessive home attention and expectation that students do their homework and try to learn their lessons and show up to school. If we had on the part of underrepresented minorities such intense involvement in schools, and we still saw academic skills gaps or representational gaps, then I will contemplate systemic racism. But right now, the behavioral differences, the cultural differences are too great. And those are what we should focus on as explanations and what we should focus on to remedy if we want to close the gaps.
Thank you, Heather. Now, you've been attacked many times. You've been canceled, I believe. And I suspect that you will also get attacked after the publication of this book very strongly. And so one of the criticisms against you and your writing is that emphasizing these racial skill gaps is actually very divisive. So what can you say to that? And how can we sort of cope with these gaps in a more healthy manner, do you think?
Well, you've channeled wonderfully the New York Times CNN position, which is just hilarious. I followed this in the Trump years, that it was Trump who was being divisive. Apparently, it's not divisive to use white as an epithet, which is what the mainstream media does. All you need to do to take down any individual or any institution is to say that individual or that institution is white. That does it. You can notice this in the New York Times. And it is not divisive, apparently, for President Biden, both while he was running for president and in his speech upon the eve of his inauguration and in his inauguration speech, to go around accusing whites of being white supremacist and being the source of the enduring stain on American souls. So the big question is, people have raised this, everybody else gets to have identity politics but whites. Whites are expected to quietly take the abuse, and frankly, it is abuse. And the question is that odd asymmetrical truce going to last much longer? But as far as whether it's divisive to bring things up, again, I simply will not cop to the charge of being divisive when it is the left who goes around accusing the founders, well, the founders were literally racist. But so what? That they also were extraordinary thinkers. But the left is accusing every single institution, including promptness, including expectations of exactitude, including expectations of courtesy. All of this is now deemed culpably white. So I'm not divisive, the left is. I'm responding to their attacks. As far as what can be done, I get this question all the time, what can we do? And I will be honest, at some point, there's not a whole lot more that we can do. I fully subscribe at this point to the brilliant Amy Wax theory in her Rights and Remedies book, which is that, the analogy of somebody who's been very seriously injured in a car accident, and one can acknowledge the distribution of fault, but at some point for that victim to heal himself and be able to regain mobility, he has to engage in physical therapy and take responsibility, and I hate to use this word, it's such an academic nauseating word, but ownership of his healing. And at this point, yes, there's the tried and true conservative remedies, which is charter schools, vouchers. I'm less than wildly enthusiastic about those, especially since many of the no excuses charter schools are tacking rapidly to the left. But we can continue to try to make sure that schools have high expectations, that we're not putting teachers in front of students based on the irrelevancies of their race. And I can tell you this, to the extent that we do insist that the color of a class should determine the color of its teacher, we are guaranteeing further racial skills gaps, because Blacks score the lowest on academic skills. And so if you're using race to select your teachers and not academic skills, you're really screwing those students. So we can do things, but frankly, at this point, the changes really have to come from within, and that is jettisoning the poisonous acting white ideology and embracing academic success and effort. Not success necessarily, but simply academic effort as a route to a middle-class life. And I'll throw in the other two prongs of what's been called the success sequence. Wait until you're married to have a baby, and work full-time at a job, any job, and graduate from high school. That's it. That's all you have to do to have a 75% chance of being in the middle class.
Mm-hmm. So your book empirically documents and discusses 3 examples of what you call this attack on meritocracy. The first one being the attack on medicine and biomedical science. So what's going on in medicine? If you want, maybe I can also quote you from your book. You say, the proponents of the systemic racism hypothesis are making a large bet with potentially lethal consequences. In accordance with the idea that racism causes racial health disparities, they are changing the direction of medical research, the composition of medical faculty, the curriculum of medical schools, the criteria for hiring researchers and for publishing research, and the standards for assessing professional excellence. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Well, I can't remember if you guys have had Stanley Goldfarb, so I hate to repeat him if he's been before.
No, we didn't.
Oh, okay. Well, again, here's the rule of thumb. It's all coming down. I often hear when I'm doing media interviews or something, the host will say something, well, we all thought, oh, these silly snowflakes, the madness in the academy won't go anywhere, because as soon as it hits the real world, it'll all go poof and we'll all get back to normalcy again. and I hold my tongue because I think you are an idiot. Like, if you ever thought that anything going on in the academy was going to stay put, you just weren't paying attention. And, you know, we also thought that STEM would be unaffected. Again, idiot. Everything is going to be affected. And so medicine, the MCATs have a disparate impact on Blacks. Therefore, we will.
What is the MCAT, sorry?
The medical school admissions test, medical college admissions test. This is the medical school version of SATs or the medical school version of LSATs or GLPs. It's the usual standardized test, the usual standardized test that for the last 4 decades has been put through microscopic analysis to make sure that there's no possible reference to the regatta or anything that can be seen as being somehow culturally privileging for rich white Mayflower descendants. It is absolutely objective, neutral, and tests the skills that are important for medical school admissions. Well, like every objective academic skill, colorblind test, it has a disparate impact on Blacks. And so, of course, for decades, and you know, here we are again with racial preferences and schools being before the court. It was the racial preferences back in the 70s with the case of Bakke versus University or Davis that shows that racial preferences in medicine are long-standing, and Black and Hispanic students are admitted with MCAT scores that would be usually automatically disqualifying if presented by whites and Asians. What happens when they've been admitted with those otherwise disqualifying scores? Mismatch theory kicks in, as Richard Sander has so brilliantly explained. Those students end up struggling in their classes. They're at the bottom of their classes, and they have the same problem passing future tests. And so at the second year of medical school, students have to pass what's known as Part 1 of the U.S. medical licensing exam. That test used to be graded, you know, A through F. But because Black students weren't doing well on it, 2 years ago, it went to a pass-fail basis. There's pressure to do away with the MCAT scores entirely, or MCAT tests entirely. Some schools have already done so. And the pressure is on in every single faculty. You guys all go through this in whatever department you're in. You know that every single faculty search is one desperate effort to try and find remotely qualified females or URMs to hire. The same thing is going on in medical schools. And what's most amazing, I have somebody from an oncologist who sends me on virtually a daily basis things from across the medical ecosphere, whether it's from Nature magazine or Science or JAMA or Lancet. The medical research organs and our most prestigious, what were once our most prestigious spokes organizations of medicine, are on a daily basis putting out lies about how medicine is racist, how science is racist. So you have the lowering of standards, and then the other part of my chapter in that book is about the idea that health disparities can only be the result of racism. And so you're not allowed to talk about behavior that does lead to the real health disparities between Blacks and whites. We saw this during COVID. Blacks had a higher COVID death rate. Why? Because diabetes and obesity, as bad as it is in the American population at large, and it's really bad, it's even worse among Blacks. But now, of course, that would be fat shaming. And to talk about weight loss with Blacks is viewed as a form of racism. So the only allowable explanation for racial disparities is racism. And that means that doctors, if they talk about behavior change, and sadly few of them do in any case, they will be accused of racism.
Pat, feel free to ask a question. Please try to be concise, though.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you, Heather. As always, I have two comments or questions, one regarding race, one regarding gender. So the way to deal with the racial problem is to say, what about African or Caribbean immigrants who experience the same racism that African Americans do, but their outcomes are very different? Or I can certainly tell you, as an Asian American, there's plenty of racism against us for all sorts of things. But having said that, we tend to have good outcomes. So you can't correlate racism with outcomes. And I think the simple example is actual Africans as opposed to African Americans. But the second point that I'd make is regard to gender. I'd hope you'd touch upon that. In diversity delusion, you touch upon that more. And one of the points that I'd make is that, for example, in STEM, most of the jobs are going to white women or university presidencies. I think we had this discussion in our email group. It's not going to underrepresented minorities. There's no Blacks or Hispanics that are going into science. There's none interviewed. It's mostly going to white women, but not to Blacks or Hispanics of either gender. Curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, I hear that a lot about Africans, and I don't actually know what the data is. If they're what this, I will posit that you're right. One thing, obviously, the fact that somebody ends up in a position, I'm sad to say, is not necessarily proof of merit, because racial preferences apply to everybody, regardless of whether they're African American or Black from another part of the world. But I will posit, for the sake of argument, that there are skills gaps within the so-called Black group between Africans and African Americans, and that is a good point. You had several years ago, the Cornell undergraduates were agreeing with you, and they said that Cornell was getting away with using Africans for various positions and shouldn't, because they haven't experienced slavery. So that would presumably be an explanation that somebody on the left might use, but it would be a complicated explanation to say that, well, Africans have not experienced slavery, because it would be a double-edged sword, because it would implicitly acknowledge that slavery might have resulted in certain behaviors that are counterproductive.
Well, it also doesn't touch upon your everyday experience. So when you walk down the street, if you're Nigerian or your great-great-grandparents were Nigerian, you're still the same person, as according to the actual racist who might or might not interact with you. And that's what's happening every day, not 300 years ago.
Right. Yeah. So, but anyway, then they would still say, even if it's from slavery, if the counterproductive behaviors are still from slavery, that still means we need reparations and shouldn't hold people responsible for them. And I would just say again, but you have to take responsibility. Whatever the cause is, you have to take responsibility. As far as racism against Asians, I'm going to have to take your word for that. I don't know. I mean, in a literal sense, what we see with the way that racial preferences are structured in academic admissions, that's certainly the case. But as far as like more
right, there's the Harvard phenomenon or the Ivy League phenomenon, which is the reverse for Blacks.
Yeah. And as far as gender and white women, yeah, clearly. I mean, white women run universities right now, and that's
they run the university.
States.
I think there is a question by Carl, and then we can move on to the other topics of the book. Carl,
two quick questions, Heather. One is that if you might assume, or many people might assume, if there's a 10% or 13%, let's say, of admissions to medical school or whatever that are not merit-based, then maybe we can tolerate 10% of our doctors not being meritly qualified. But the question to you is, what is the message? How does that undermine the other 90%? How does that undermine the whole system? And the second question is, long term, what this would tell me, is there a risk that what we're really doing is amplifying racism? Because if I go in 15 years to get a medical appointment and I'm confronted with a Black doctor, I'm like, my first question is, oh my goodness, is this person, I don't want to be treated by a Black doctor, because there's a possibly a high probability that this guy never should have gone to medical school. So if you can comment on those things.
Well, first of all, I don't think it is tolerable to have 10% not qualified, who I don't think you would want to show up by your very second question to that 10%. I just don't think you do not solve the skills gap by coming in after the fact and lowering standards. That helps nobody. And nobody should be served by a professional in any field for whom standards have been lowered. And if you are only positing in 13 years that you would have that second, that doubt about somebody in the beneficiary class of racial preferences, I admire your your innocence and your naivete, because I have to say, I assume whether it's females, I mean, come on, you in the sciences, you know about manels and fanels. We had Francis Collins, the outgoing head of the NIH, I guess he's out now, declaring that he was not going to attend manels. These are masculine, male-dominated or gatherings. Neil Ferguson at Stanford got in trouble for trying to organize a non-manel in the field of behavioral history and didn't do so, and got killed for that. So if I'm seeing a fanel, which is a female-dominated panel, which of course is perfectly marvelous, unlike manels, I'm going to assume that those are not the most qualified people there. And certainly that's the case with minorities as well. We had a book by Stephen Carter, the Yale law professor, back in the 90s called Reflections of an Affirmative Action Baby. And he talked about his own self-doubt whenever he's put in a position. Is he the best torts lawyer for that position, or is the best Black torts lawyer? And those may sometimes be identical, and they may not be. So preferences of any variety always end up casting doubt on their so-called beneficiaries.
Dorian and Jonathan.
Quick question. So at some point in the discussion so far, you posed the thought experiment where if you had two groups, one where people claim they're discriminated against, and you ensured that group followed the behavioral standards, let's call them group B, of group A, and you waited 15 or 20 years and checked in, and you said, if outcome differences persist, then you would accept the hypothesis of systemic bias. Is that correct?
Correct.
So I wonder if that's a false choice. What if the two groups, the two populations have different skill sets, inherent skill sets? So for example, if you consider mathematics, it's possible that if you ran that experiment, you would end up still having more men than women after the 20 years. And I'm wondering if you've taken that into account in your thinking.
Well, you're absolutely right. I have no reason to doubt Lawrence Summers and other people that have come in that there is a absolute disparity in the way high-end and low-end math skills are distributed, and that males predominate at the top end of math and at the bottom end of math skills. And that will not change absent, I don't know what, some kind of radical genetic engineering. As far as other areas of disparities, I guess my fallback position at this point is that the cultural differences and gaps are so big that we can focus on them for the next 2 decades and still probably have some ways to go in closing the skills gap. Let's be honest, these are you are raising the heritability question. It is absolutely toxic. It's a minefield. And the safe position is to say, I don't need to reach that because there's so much that can be done to reduce the gaps. And I would also say that our goal should not necessarily even be that in the high-end cognitive professions that there is proportional representation, and that may be impossible to not avoid. But what would really help in America today in racial relations is something much simpler than that, which is assimilation to various bourgeois norms. And I again invoke Amy Wax and her the instigating violation of right think that she wrote with Larry Alexander at the University of San Diego Law School, talking about the importance of bourgeois norms. If we could have all of our different ethnic groups simply subscribe to child-rearing practices that cultivated respect for authority, self-discipline, self-control, not screaming at your boss, that would go a really far way to making this a country where people were not walking around on eggshells.
I agree 100% about the your emphasis on changes in cultural behavior. The only comment I would have is you might want to be careful about proposing that thought experiment because there is a potential alternative explanation that's not systemic bias.
But it's not going to come from that won't come from the left. Right. I mean, I'm not the thought experiment is not going to be critiqued by my usual enemies.
That's true. But what if you actually ran the experiment and then you found that differences persisted? You wouldn't want them to say, okay, now we proved.
I would love to run the experiment, but that would be very hard to get all the institutional approvals lined up, I'm sure.
Jonathan.
So, Heather, I've spent my entire life fighting racism. I grew up in South Africa under apartheid. And, this medical example you gave is pretty terrifying to me, because it's one thing to, ignore quality differences on a job or something. But to expect people to ignore quality difference when it comes to their own health, I think is a little unrealistic. So if indeed you're right, and if indeed we are selecting students in such a way that the average quality of Black doctors is lower than white doctors, we are in a sense setting up a situation where people are going to be rationally racist. And I don't know what your comments are on that, but it's pretty terrifying.
Yeah, well, I think we should be rationally racist in any profession where there's preferences. I'm sorry. It is anytime you have race norming, which is what's been going on, you are going to have lower skills. And I suppose what happens is, there's this other justification within the medical schools. And, let me add here, the AMA and the American Association of Medical Colleges are just completely left-wing at this point. If you're not familiar with this, it would blow your mind, the sort of rhetoric that they're putting out and the policies that they're putting out. But one of the explanations or one of the justifications for using preferences in admissions and then in promotions and in putting people on staffs of hospitals and whatnot is that Blacks want to have a doctor who looks like them. And I think that the evidence there is mixed. I know a Jewish oncologist told me that one of his patients said, I want to get me a Jewish doctor. And so she didn't care about the race of her doctor. To the extent that that's true, I mean, it's going to mean probably in less competitive, lower quality clinics in inner cities, you are going to get doctors there. And of course, it's a weird thing because the left would say, well, that's right. They should have Black doctors. And the fact that Black doctors on average, and of course I should have put this in earlier, the usual disclaimer that I actually have in the book, which is that I'm speaking about averages and not individuals. There are thousands and thousands of Blacks who whoop the ass of Asians and Jews and whites in general. So you don't necessarily know for any individual what you're dealing with, but the averages are what they are. So you are going to have, presumably in lower prestige environments, less good doctors. Now that may happen anyway, even without the racial spin on all of this. It is the case that medicine, to a certain extent, is not evenly distributed. On the other hand, you have the irony of, in many cases, inner city Blacks get the very best medical care because they are in urban centers that have highly competitive medical schools. And so they're going into environments where some of the best residents are treating them. Once they get out, though, and if they're using their local clinics, I don't know. But yes, there's the sorting can be a
But
problem.
Heather, that wasn't really my concern. My concern is individuals. I mean, we've tried as a society to get people to treat people as individuals and not treat people as races. But the extent to which people systematically face medical care and they notice that when they face that medical care, they get lower quality care from Black doctors and white doctors, feeds into the notion that, you know, Black people are not this, you know, that feeds into the racist notion of judging a person by their race. And it's, to me, that's a very, very worrying side effect from this current insanity.
But it's already going on, as I say. I mean, again, you may be like Mr. News, and if you're not already making those judgments, I applaud you, but I already do. You know, I've had Black doctors walk through the room, and you face that moment of decision. What do you do? Now, this happened to be in Irvine, California, a podiatrist. I thought I'm willing to take my chances here, but it's utterly unfair. It's the tyranny of the group average. You know, it's what the law-abiding Blacks go through when they're followed around the drugstore by the store clerk. They can say this is racist and it's completely unfair. On the other hand, the clerk is also acting rationally because the disparities in criminal offending are so huge. And the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of people who are committing shoplifting in urban areas are Black. I'm sorry, hard to say, uncomfortable to say, but true. Does that mean that every Black is a criminal? No, but the disproportionate number of criminals are Black. And so you have a very difficult situation where, you know, I think Lee Jussim has talked about, perhaps, or I may be mischaracterizing his thinking, but there is rational discrimination. And the solution to that is not to blame the person who is making perfectly valid inferences from his knowledge of the ubiquity of racial preferences. The solution to that is to make racial preferences no longer necessary, either because we have closed the skills gap or because we say, to hell with this, we're going back to meritocracy. We're going to let the disparities fall where they may, and we'll deal with those later, but we are not going to lower our standards anymore.
Okay. Steve? Okay. Steve Baginski, are you there? Okay, John started. Unmute yourself, John, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Heather, for speaking truth. I just had a couple of points to make. One is that stereotyping, which is much condemned, as you know, is nothing but the basic psychological phenomenon, stimulus generalization. I did a lot of research with animals. Animals show it very well, so do human beings. If most of the criminals that you encounter or the system encounters are Black, then you will form the generalization with respect to Blacks. That's absolutely right. And several people have pointed out affirmative action kinds of programs simply accelerate that. They simply accelerate that. In other words, if you pick black students, let's say for admission to elite colleges, based on weaker criteria than whites, they will probably perform less well than whites. The other students around them will look at them and say, oh, blacks just aren't very good. So it accelerates racial discrimination, not not diminishes it. The other point I want to make is just to echo what you say about medicine. This really about elite journals and so on. The anti-science attitude of the elite journals, Nature and Science and so on, is just unbelievable to me, absolutely unbelievable. You get editorial after editorial slandering science as racist, slandering science, not slandering, let's say, the hiring practices or something of that sort, but science itself, which seems to me incredibly dangerous. I mean, science is simply facts. What you do with the facts may be racist, but the facts themselves simply stand neutral. But this standard is apparently being abolished by the leaders of the scientific establishment. And that seems to me just incredibly dangerous. And one of the things it means is that their allegiance to science, let's say of the editors of Nature and Science, their allegiance to science is weaker than their allegiance to social justice. And the fact of the matter is social justice and science do not mix. Any comments on that? Thank you again.
Well, yeah, I would only put social justice in brackets. I think we should not give it any reality. It's a meaningless phrase, and their means, if they were ever to achieve it, it certainly would not be socially just. But yes, I mean, just to repeat, so I'm going to repeat myself and repeat you. If you guys are not aware of what's coming out of the science establishment, it would blow your mind. It is beyond belief. They're treating science as if it's about scientists, not the scientific method. No, science is a method. It is a achievement of epic proportions, a way of understanding the world, of testing hypotheses that has given us every single atom of prosperity and convenience and comfort and safety around us today, that we are all in constant threat of being ingrates towards. And as far as like the acceleration of stereotyping, yes, one of the weird things about our current world is we're forced to act out various theatrical fictions. We had the theatrical fiction after the awful January 6th riot that white supremacists are the threat of civil peace, and so you had the security agencies living out the fiction that really that's who's the violence. And so we had all these, everybody's got their expectations of, August 2021 there was going to be another white supremacist riot, and it never happened, and they've never happened. They keep never happening, but we keep getting our hopes up. And the other thing that we're all supposed to pretend is that these skills gaps don't exist. And so, I imagine, I really wonder how high school students and college students, many of them I think must be extremely cynical by now, because the high school students, they all compare each other's SATs, and they know what they got, and they know who got into the cherished Ivies and who didn't, and they can see that the Black students are getting in with SATs that would have been, again, automatically disqualifying if presented by whites and Asians. And yet, so then everybody gets into college, and then we're all supposed to pretend that racial preferences don't exist. And I should also note that the racial preference rhetoric on the part of its advocates is utterly self-contradictory. Because if you say, and this is of course what also got Amy Wax in trouble, although she denies ever saying it, but one could say on average to an average Black student, and you wouldn't say it to that student, but on average, we know that many Black students at UPenn Law School or any other law school or any other medical school are the beneficiaries of racial preferences. That is just the reality. But if you say that, that's racist. On the other hand, the schools go to the Supreme Court and say, if you take away racial preferences, we will die and wither as an institution. We will not be able to achieve what is our summum bonum, which is our entire reason for being. It has nothing to do with knowledge. It has nothing to do with transmission of inheritance. It is all about diversity. Without racial preferences, we die. So you're supposed to both affirm the necessity of racial preferences and then deny that they even exist.
Thank you, Heather. So let me continue a little bit so we are able to cover the other two topics, the arts and then policing. Before we move on to the arts, one thing that I thought was important is that you compare our approach versus the Chinese approach. You said China takes the opposite task to this leveling mania. It identifies top math talent early on and gives mathematically gifted students accelerated instruction. Its rigorous university entrance exams reward effort and achievement, not identity, etc., etc. So I wonder whether you can talk a little bit about this comparison between China and the US and the implications this has for our competitiveness internationally.
Yeah, well, I confess that I tend to arguably romanticize China, and China obviously has huge problems, but I revere meritocracy. And so to the extent that China is truly intellectually meritocratic, I admire it to no end. Now, it may not be, and there may be within that system some sort of corruption, but I'm told that, in fact, dinner companion this weekend was describing to me, and he was critical of this, the utter oppression that Chinese high school students feel in studying for this all-important exit exam from high school that determines where they get into college. And I will admit, as a theoretical matter, but my heart's not in it, that one can overdo academic preparation, because I really do believe that knowledge and learning and bettering yourself intellectually is the one of the more important things that one can do. But I'll just sort of say, okay, maybe they go too far, but generally they do. They are constantly looking for their best math talent and throwing everything they've got at it. And so they are always, they're way ahead. Maybe they're not the top every year, I'm not sure, on various math exams, the Math Olympiad, Stanford exams, I'm not sure, but they are certainly high up, and certainly the United States is way down. Now, some people will say, well, if you take out white students, white American students, we actually do pretty well. And presumably if you took out white or Asian American students, we'd do even better. But on average, we're way, way behind. And we're making sure that we'll stay behind by decimating our gifted and talented programs in our exam schools like Stuyvesant in New York City, or Lowell High School in San Francisco, or Thomas Jefferson in Virginia. Now, again, China rather is ahead of us in many critical technologies that have military applications, many of the nanotechnologies. So that looks to me bad and impressive at the same time. On the other hand, being scientifically skilled is no guarantee of rationality, because China's COVID policies were perhaps the most insane in the entire world. And it's depressing to me, because my theory for the West's COVID hysteria was the feminization of our culture. But I don't think China is very feminized yet. So there was something else going on there. Now, maybe you can have two similar phenomena with two different causes in different spots. But so China is not free from absolutely appallingly bad public policy. And obviously its reigning ideology is also contrary to empirical fact about how markets work. But I would say still on intellectual matters, I would be worried, and I am worried that they are ultimately, when they stop sending, if China were to stop sending us its STEM students. Obviously, many STEM departments would have to close down because we just don't have the domestic talent to fill them.
Okay, so why don't we move on to the arts? So as bad as the situation is in medicine, what you described about the arts was actually pretty shocking to me. It seems to me that the demolition of standards is even more radical within the arts. I don't know if you would agree, but can you tell us a little bit what's going on in the arts, in music, the opera, etc.?
Well, they went through the same George Floyd hysteria as everybody else. So within a month or weeks of the riots in 2020 and June 2020 and throughout the summer, you had every classical music organization putting out statements accusing itself of racism and accusing the classical music tradition of racism. It accused the tradition of racism simply by virtue of demographic reality. Europe was white. You know, there were no Blacks around more or less in the Renaissance to write madrigals. Sorry, you know, there were a few maybe, but they were not enough to show up within the tradition. Same in Poland for Chopin's nocturnes. There were not Blacks to be writing polonaises and nocturnes in Poland, and yet we look upon our tradition, we say it's a European tradition, it's overwhelmingly white, therefore by definition, it's racist and white supremacist. Well, interestingly, this sort of test is never applied to other non-Western traditions. So nobody goes to Chinese classical opera and says, well, Chinese classical opera is racist and anti-white because its performers over the centuries have been Chinese. Of course they have. That's who's in China. Nobody says that Yoruba drum language is anti-white or racist because the Yoruba drummers have been Black Africans. Of course they were. That's who was in Africa. Only the West is engaged in this ritual of self-flagellation and hatred because of its demographic past. As far as its demographic present or institutional present, no classical music organization is discriminating against Black performers today. To the opposite is the case. Black performers are being catapulted way ahead of white and Asian colleagues. Baltimore Symphony just named a Black conductor. He's a very nice man. He loves music, but he is not of the league. And I wish him well, and maybe he will develop on the job. But he is the second youngest conductor to be put in charge of a major orchestra at his age. Zubin Mehta was the first. Mehta had a record of leading major symphony orchestras globally that Jonathan Hayward never had. He's there only because he's Black, and it was made clear from the very start when Marin Alsop at Baltimore announced her leaving that they were going to get a Black.
Zubin Mehta had Asian male privilege.
Back then it didn't exist, maybe today. So anyway, the idea that they're discriminating is further insane, because when it comes to auditioning orchestra members, orchestral auditions occur behind a screen. This was a ritual that was put up mainly to prevent what was viewed as gender discrimination. But now nobody knows who the identity is, at least in the initial rounds. And no conductor. Conductors are fanatical perfectionists. They are not going to put up somebody as the chair of the horn department who's going to flub some solo in a Strauss tone poem. That conductor does not care about race or sex. He wants the best possible performer. Nevertheless, you have organization after organization, racism in opera, racism in chamber music, racism in early music, that is putting pressure on organizations to hire, to program. Programming is now determined by race. There's a trio of mediocrities who are showing up in concert programs across the country. Florence Price, early 20th century female Black composer, Jessie Montgomery, who's contemporary, And the worst of all is Joseph Bologna, the Chevalier. There's a movie coming out about him. It said that he was the Black Mozart. The more radical among us will say that no, actually Mozart was the white Chevalier. I can spot a piece by Joseph Bologna from the very first note that it shows up on the classical music radio station, because it is so unrelentingly banal. But students are being told that this is great music, and the only reason that he wasn't performed in the past was racism. The art museums are doing the same thing. They are denouncing Dutch Golden Age still lifes as simply pretexts and ways of benefiting from colonialism. They're telling viewers to see colonialism in the gorgeous silver tureens and cut crystal glass. The Metropolitan Museum of Art has, I think it may have just gone down, I don't know if it's still up there, the most appalling exhibit I've written about yet, that claims that anti-slavery art is actually a function of white supremacy. So it's happening in theater. The theater world has been absolutely turned head over heels by a organization that formed after George Floyd called I See You White American Theater. Every theater director is absolutely tearing his hair in knots to hire the first Broadway season after the George Floyd race riots. Every single new play that was mounted had a Black playwright. Such things need not be in contradiction or tension with meritocracy, but when you have any type of criterion that is not centrally related to what should be the grounding reasons for hiring, whether it's race, sex, or anything else, or red hair, if you introduce an irrelevancy, you will on average lower the candidates that you choose. And so that's what we're also facing in the art world. And we're teaching young people to hate a tradition that contains so much sublimity and beauty and grandeur and wit, by teaching them that they should read novels through the lens of race and sex. And this is nothing new. Again, I escaped this in the 70s as an English major, but by the 80s, that absolutely malpractice view was ubiquitous within humanities departments.
Speaking of museums, can you talk about the story of the docents at the Art Institute of Chicago, which was very shocking to me?
Well, the Art Institute of Chicago, like many great art institutes, relies on a very large group of volunteer labor to lead student groups around. And the docent program at the Art Institute was brought into being in the 1950s at a time of very high rates of volunteerism. You had lots of civic organizations that were formed in Chicago. Females got involved in raising a major fund drive for the Art Institute of Chicago. And as a result of forming for that, they decided they would stay formed, and they said, well, we should have a specific program for student education. And at the time, the theory was, well, you should have professional educators for students. And they said, no, we'll do volunteers. It is a very rigorous program. You have to basically write what would be an MA thesis. You have to be trained in all the various departments of the Art Institute of Chicago. And they already were doing diversity modules of how do you make things relevant for Chicago's diverse student population. But the current head of the Institute, James Rondeau, came in 2019, I think, on a big anti-racism platform, and looked around and said, oh my God, the docents are overwhelmingly white. They're also female, but it was their whiteness that really did them in. And so he ended the docent program. He said, that's it, no more docents. You guys are too white. And instead, they were like 100 that were able to be available on a regular basis to take students around from all over the city. And so he was going to go to a bunch of paid volunteers, could only afford 6. So we've got six now student art educators. And they, of course, have to be chosen on diversity grounds. The woman that runs the department is herself, of course, a Black female. And so this idiot, and I've got some really, he gave a speech at the University of the Iowa Des Moines Art Institute that I quote verbatim, and I ask you to read it because it took me like 2 days to get down every last and like, and that James Rondeau put out in a short period, but it was a real feat of transcription. The guy's a total idiot. And he's all into equity, except when it comes to, he was asked by Alice Walton, who's one of the heirs of the Walmart fortune. And Walton has a very progressive museum in Arkansas. And she approached Rondeau and she said, would you do me a favor? You have all of this art that's in your warehouse that's not on the walls, as does every museum. I would like to take some of that art and tour it through what is basically rural populations, i.e. white rural populations, and just to give them some cultural uplift. And Rondeau sneered, and this is by his own recounting. He's the one recounting his conversation with Alice Walton. And he said, basically, Alice, don't give me this, let the masses eat Shakespeare. That's not what these people need. I don't think that they're capable of my Toulouse-Lautrec's. But by the way, Alice, can I hit you up for some money for my Black and Hispanic museums in Chicago here? So if you're white, you don't get any kind of diversity help or artistic help. So Rondeau's a real piece of work, and it's fun reading about him in this chapter.
Okay, I'll give priority to people who have not asked questions yet. So Jackson first, and then Will.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, so first you mentioned issues in the art world, and how much of that is the art world like around the globe or just in the US? And then relatedly, you mentioned like that China has more of a meritocracy. I've also heard of the notorious exams to get into the Indian Institutes of Technology. My wife, who's from Iran, similar exams. So how much of these issues are just specific to the United States, and as far as you know?
Well, in the art world, generally, and this is just true for all sorts of identity politics, it's the Anglosphere that's the problem. You guys probably know, and Pat knows, Canada is maybe even worse than we are when regards to identity politics. Australia's bad, New Zealand's bad, and Britain is pretty damn bad. Britain did another white culling. There's something there called the English touring opera, and it goes around and mounts operas in far-flung places of the UK outside of London. And half of its orchestra members were culled because they were white. And part of what's going on is the funding organizations. Britain has the Arts Council of England. They lay down these rules and say, if you're too white, we're not giving you any money. And that's going on now in the United States with the Mellon Foundation, the National Arts Associate, what is our federal NEA and NEH, National Endowment for the Arts, NEH as well, National Endowment for the Humanities. They are also requiring diversity on boards, diversity in staff, diversity in programming. So
the rest of the Anglosphere is actually worse than America.
I would
argue.
Back and forth, and so, but it's not just the Anglosphere. The Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, they mounted a show called Slavery, and they went around and they put wall labels on 80 of some of their greatest works, complaining about the fact that they didn't have enough Black people. One of their greatest of all Rembrandt canvases, The Night Watchman, that's a wall size. It's the greatest work they possess. They wrote a deconstructive wall label about that, complaining that all of the Guard, the Amsterdam Guard, were all white. even though Amsterdam had like some minute Black population. Well, on a per capita basis, there's like 20 guardsmen in the Rembrandt painting. On a per capita basis, with the population of Blacks in Amsterdam at that time, it would have yielded you maybe like 0.0000001% of a Black. But here's the Rijksmuseum criticizing its own collection for not being sufficiently woke. So it is happening elsewhere. I can disagree or not with Pat about whether it's worse in the Anglosphere, but on the other hand, you've had some great pushback. You know, Macron famously said that he was not going to be tearing down statues. We'll see if that holds. But the French so far are not turning on the philosophes. As far as the exams, your question was how bad are they, or are they starting to pull back again on meritocracy?
Like the absence of a focus on meritocracy. Like, is that only just like an American thing, or is it?
Well, any place that has guilt, whether it's with regards to indigenous populations or Black populations or colonialism, they're pulling back on meritocracy. China, its leadership seems impervious to guilt. They're not guilty about Mao, as far as we can tell. They're not guilty about the Cultural Revolution, as far as we can tell. They may have tried to reverse course to a certain extent, but there certainly don't seem to be doing guilt policies about that. But fortunately, they have restored the place of the academy to where it should be, which is as a generator of new knowledge, and I hope as a transmitter of tradition.
Okay, Will.
Thanks for your talk, Heather. So you've mentioned how a lot of social trends are accelerating toward more and more racial preferences, but there's going to be, potentially some corrective to this in the near future if the Supreme Court strikes down affirmative action. So we see a lot of universities preparing for this, it seems to me, by getting rid of SAT requirements, withdrawing from US News rankings. It's not hard to, but some universities are sort of defecting from this trend. So MIT recently reinstituted its SAT. So yeah, I'm just curious if you've thought about, how do you see all this shaking out over the next 5 or 10 years?
Thank you for that question. I actually haven't thought about it. So memo to self, think about question. In the next 5 to 10 years, I'll tell you this, and I sometimes say this. I have to preface this. I am a pessimist by nature, and I can tell looking around the world in my 66 or 67 years of experience now, I don't know, I lose track, that there really are these foundational pre-rational dispositions towards the world. And I'm amazed at you optimists out there. I look at, like, how can you be optimistic? Look at all the bad stuff. And you look at me and you say, how can you not see all the shoots for hope? So I tend to be, I think I'm justified in being pessimistic, having started observing these things since the 80s. Things have only gotten worse. So why should things turn around now? So I actually, having also observed what happened in California when the voters there passed Proposition 209, which banned racial preferences in government. This was passed in 1996. And now I guess there was a slight diminution of racial preferences in the California university system, both the University of California and Cal State University. Some, but there was a hell of a lot of law breaking. And the holistic admissions idea is one of the results of efforts to ban racial preferences, because you can always claim that there were other considerations that were so marvelous that they trumped the academic deficits that this or that student shows. So I expect that holistic admissions will be even more powerful in the wake of the expected reversal of Bakke, although I'm not 100% sure there, but I hope that it is reversed, and I would hope that it gets reversed on mismatch grounds, because I think that mismatch theory is the most powerful critique of racial preferences. But as you rightly note, my theory for why these schools for the last couple of years have been not just making standardized tests optional, but in the case of California, actually forbidding their use or offering them, is that they want to put the College Board out of existence, because it doesn't make sense from an institutional perspective. Let's leave aside the Supreme Court case, but this was going on before this. It doesn't make sense to ban the submission of SATs because colleges have been race norming anyway. And as an admissions officer, you would think you'd want as much information as possible. The existence of SAT scores does not prevent you from introducing vast racial preferences. You simply race norm them. You have one set of standards for whites and Asians, and you have another set of standards for Blacks and Hispanics. And delivering SATs, submitting them, allows universities to select within those pools and to rank students so that they can get the best Black student and the best Asian student, rather than using a lottery, which is the rational conclusion to what they claim to believe in. So why are they saying you can't even submit SATs? Because they want to put the SAT out of existence, because as long as these standardized test scores exist, they provide us with empirical evidence of the academic skills gap, which I argue in the book is a much better explanation for racial disparities than racism. So I think that if the court does overturn Bakke and the diversity rationale, you'll see probably a universal exclusion of standardized tests. And I don't know. That's a very good question of what are the long-term ramifications. Do you have any suggestions that I can poach on when this comes up again?
I don't know. I doubt anything will work, but I think the California state government has been pretty lax about trying to enforce. I mean, I don't think the California state government would have ever passed this law on its own. It was a plebiscite.
Right.
So I don't think that they've ever been very interested in enforcing it. If there was some kind of enforcement, say, some sunshine laws or something like this, where the kind of analysis that R.C. Diacono had done for the Harvard case was just being done on a regular basis, I think that would be somewhat difficult. It also seems to me that schools have an incentive to defect. I mean, if you look at MIT, I expect some schools like UNC, UT Austin, University of Florida that are controlled by Republican governments, I think are likely to defect on this. They don't have any reason to get rid of the SATs, that seems to me. So that might also provide some contrary pressure, but I don't know. I mean, it seems like there are a lot of forces pushing in all kinds of directions. It also seems to me that people on the right have been more willing to file lawsuits about discrimination than they probably were 10 or 15 years ago. So but I agree with everything you said about it, that there are very, very strong trends pushing in the other direction as well. You saw some foreshadowing of that in the oral arguments for the UNC case in particular. They were talking about, well, is it okay if somebody talks about their experience as an underrepresented minority in their personal essay, and we really liked the way that they talked about it, then could we use that? And I think that the judges basically said yes, that would be fine. So that provides something of an out. But anyway, I think it'll be, but it'll be hard. It would be hard to be doing that for every single Black applicant without producing some kind of statistical evidence that this was happening, right? So I don't know. I think yeah, the short answer is I don't know. That's why I asked you.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, it's an absolutely fascinating question to try and game theory this out, because you say, well, there's no reason for MIT or somebody else to get rid of the SAT. Well, there is, if having the SAT, and if there is way to get at it, and there's transparency, and we see how hard UPenn Law School is fighting Amy Wax's request for the grades and LSATs of its admits, and the Honor Society and the Order of the Coif, because those will show the existence of mismatch in racial preferences. But so if they keep the SAT and their admission statistics are available, it will show preferences. And I don't believe that they're willing to bite the bullet and be colorblind. I think, people always ask, do they really believe this? And it's sort of like, do college presidents really believe it when they say their institutions are racist? And it kind of doesn't matter. But I actually, if you put a gun to my head, I actually do believe that they somehow think that everything hangs on whether they are diverse as a college, and that shows that they're not racist, and that they are absolutely committed to that effort at proportional representation. So they're going to be able to adhere to a ban on racial preferences only if they get rid of objective tests. So you can't come in after the fact and say, you're admitting Blacks with a standard deviation below of SATs. But if they get rid of standardized tests, how are they going to find and cream the top whites and Asians? So it's really going to be a very, very difficult situation for them. And I love it. I mean, every piece of agony that this puts them through, they brought on themselves.
Thank you, Heather. And if you have, we are running out of time, but Beth Fama also had a question, and I'm going to pose the question for you. She was interested, you mentioned at the beginning that you were immersing yourself into audible civil rights history, and that, that it was showing some whitewashing. So she wanted you to expand on that, if it's possible, in the last 1 or 2 minutes.
It was showing some what?
Whitewashing?
Whitewashing, yeah. Well, I mean, I just think when you read the details of how absolutely abysmal, heartbreaking whites' treatments of Blacks were, the gratuitous nastiness in the North and the South after the Civil War, well into the 20th century, it is utterly heartbreaking. And my sense is that the conservative narrative, it's the Civil War, 500,000 died, gave their lives to try and end slavery. Yes, we went back to Jim Crow, but then we had the civil rights revolution, and finally we made good on that promissory note. But I'm in a situation now, and I would say that I think that white privilege is no longer the reality today. I think Black privilege is the reality, and I'm not in a university, so I don't need to get worry about getting fired for saying that, like the guy down in Florida. But I do have a hard time now when I read the standard conservative rhetoric about American exceptionalism that talks about the nation of freedom and opportunity. I'm tempted, along, frankly, with the 1619 Project, at the very least, to put in a footnote and say, but what about Blacks? I don't know. And so I'm struggling with this. I don't know if every statement that one makes about American history that doesn't take into account that for almost all of it, we were treating Blacks with complete violation of our stated principles and going around telling the world that we were the beacon of freedom. How you need to qualify those statements. And I may end up saying you don't. I may end up saying you don't. And I also, you know, I've been talking with various people that are trying to talk me out of my despair and my confusion, who rightly point out that things were always much worse elsewhere, whether it's regards to slavery or maltreatment of the other. That is, I'm willing to accept that. But nevertheless, this is my country, and I've been asked, like, well, you weren't doing this. Why are you talking about we? Well, I think that's a little simplistic with regards to how we do think about national identity, that we do feel implicated in our past. So I don't know where I'm going to come out on this, but right now it's something that I'm struggling with. But I'll tell you, I thought I would cure myself of it by listening to the 1619 Project. And that kind of did it. Like it got so repetitive and it was so hilarious. So I thought, okay. And I listened to some counterpoints of that. So I thought, okay, I'll really inoculate myself. I'm listening to Howard Zinn's People's History of the Americas or the United States. It is hilarious. It is so bracing. The guy is so incredibly left-wing and hates anybody with any money or any authority or anything. It is stunning, but it's actually fun to read. So that may be pushing me back towards sanity also.
Thank you very much, Heather. This was excellent. Thank you. Well, unfortunately, we didn't manage to talk about policing, but that's an excuse to, first of all, buy the book and invite you again maybe next year. So this was wonderful. We keep getting questions, but unfortunately, we ran out of time. So again, hopefully we can get you next year to talk about policing or any other thing you want to talk about. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.